speaking about the interaction now that you had with the graphic designers being in the same room with the copywriters, can you tell me more about that experience working with the graphic designer and copywriter in the same room? How that affected the time period and how that is impacting the field or industry today?
Somebody else, because I never looked that way.
Oh, okay. Can anybody speak to that?
Well, I was an art director, but when I started, I was an assistant art director, meaning that my creative director would come back from lunch with napkins with scribbles on them. This was like at 3 in the afternoon, and he was always plastered. And he would give me the napkins. He would give me the napkins to do the layouts because I could draw. So for a long time, I didn't have that experience. But once I actually started getting to work with writers, and by the way, for those of you who are art directors write the best headlines. I just want to make that clear. It changed the way things were done because it was no longer like going to Home Depot and buying some wallpaper and then taking it home and putting it up and then buying things and fitting them together. Instead, you were creating the ideas simultaneously. We take it totally for granted now. We just don't think about it. It's no different than listening to Louis Armstrong. If you listen to Louis Armstrong today, you think, wow, that's really good. It's really good jazz trumpet. And if you know anything about it, you say it's great jazz trumpet. But what people don't realize is before Louis Armstrong played that stuff, nobody did it. It just didn't exist. So it was mind-boggling back then. If any of you have listened to Love, the Beatles album, where they reconfigured all the songs, since we know all the Beatles songs, the first time you hear the album, it's like, wow, it's really weird. But then after you hear it 3 or 4 times, you kind of get used to it. But that's the same way it was. No one had done that before. So when Bernbach started that practice, where the writer and the artist would work together to create both imagery in the words and words in the imagery, things changed completely.
I mean, it sounds like there was a huge shift in the essence of the message that was being delivered. I want to talk a little bit about what you feel at that time, women's role. How did that have, if they played a bigger part in that era, how could that have impacted the way that advertising is seen today?
I'll take that one. I feel the role of women in advertising has changed drastically. And I think that's obvious, not just from the show, but from many pioneers here in South Florida. Is there people? Yeah. My mother, actually, who was a pioneer for me, she was the first woman to be a media director in Puerto Rico. And so my father worked for McCann Erickson, my mother worked for J. Walter Thompson back in the day. And her role, she had to go through so many hoops just to get to any sort of decent position. I think women back then were really regarded more for their physical attributes than any strategic capacity or intellectual capacity. Did they bring it on themselves? Maybe, in their appearance, in their dress, what have you. But still, I think the opportunities for women now, even when you look at, Beaver Silverstein here in Miami and some other pioneers in New York, it's changed drastically. The opportunity, I don't think, once you speak and you're able to portray ideas and concepts, I think the gender is really not the driving force of a decision anymore.
I think there's a couple other things to consider. Just like nobody knew about that kind of work before, nobody really at the time considered whether the situation was correct or not. Marshall McLuhan said that, I don't know who discovered water, but it wasn't a fish. There were plenty of people who were in that environment who had never dawned on them that the environment was good, bad, or otherwise. It was the environment they were in, and it was not until pioneers like your mom started to change things that people said, wait a second. But then also don't forget that you had women like Mary Wells, from Wells Rich Green. Her first name was Mary, suggesting she was a woman. And Fallon McElligott Rice, which arguably did the best work in the late 70s and in the 80s. Rice was Nancy Rice. So there were plenty of women who were doing amazing work. And when you think for product goods, for packaged goods rather, the consumers were women. It made perfect sense that women would understand how to speak to women. On the other hand, the first product I worked on was maxi pads. So apparently you don't have to have the experience to be able to sell a product.
Also, I think a lot of women's roles were kept undercover. They might have come up with that winning idea or that winning strategy, but the men would take the credit. No offense, but
we weren't there. We weren't there.
You guys were drinking scotch. So I think that's also a part of, you know, I think we would never really know how much influence, unless you speak to women from that era, but yeah, I think there was a lot of headway that they made, but we may not really know the full features of them.
In the very early 1960s, the company I was working for acquired a very large account. It's in business today, Seligman and Labs. And they had some 800 beauty salons. And I was assigned the account. What they wanted me to do was go up and have a meeting with their art director. Everything was in-house with Seligman and Labs, and they were at 666 Fifth Avenue. And I donned my gray fedora and my three-piece suit. I went up there and I was told that I would be meeting with Miss Sylvia Shields, who was the advertising manager at the time, and I was stunned. Absolutely stunned. I never had anything to do with a woman in this business for about 9 or 10 years at this point, and I was never under the impression that they were in a position of advertising manager or even to be a print buyer or anything like that, which was unheard of at the time. But I was ushered into her office, and she was absolutely charming and bright and sharp. And we had that account for 10 years, and I learned so much from her, and it began to change my whole idea of what the contribution would be on the other side of the fence. Not on the design end of it, not on the resource end of it, but on the other side of the fence, there was a power there, and they knew exactly how to work it. It was really an experience.
My next question would be, knowing a little bit about the industry at that time, how do you think the show Mad Men actually portrays the lifestyle and the times?
Well, one of the things that the show is really remarkable about, from the opening credits all the way through, the credits are definitely influenced by Saul Bass, and you can see that in the style that it's done. The show is shot below eye level, which a lot of the advertising back in the day, if you look at some of just the creative processes and the way it was displayed, is along the same lines. They take a lot of care to make sure that the sets are the same, that the concepts are the same. I think the writer of the original pilot made a point that when they shot the show around, they took it to a couple of different networks that wanted them to remove all of the smoking references. And they said, well, that's not going to be the show. You know, the pilot episode features Lucky Strike. And, you know, so it's, there's a lot of things that are very unique to that era and very authentic. And also, beyond just the advertising, I go back to again, the cultural influences. The fact that they're the only person of any ethnicity is an Italian guy, and they refer to him in not the most generous terms. You know, there's a closeted homosexual that they basically take apart in some of the series. So there's a lot of social issues as well that are very relevant to that period. And, you know, as to Arvin's point, that we're just part of everyday life, that just existed.
There was plenty of whiskey. And I had a bottle of whiskey in my drawer, and everybody in the art department had a bottle of whiskey. We went out to lunches and came back bombed. This was a tradition. This was like, and smoke. You kidding? When you walked into the bullpen, I mean, the place was a fog, coffee and everything else. And nobody knew anything.
What's a bullpen?
Bullpen is where all the artists sit. This is a room that takes. You guys know about a bullpen, right? Okay. Well, paste-up men belong in one section, and the layout men belong in another section, and that's the way things were done. The craftsmanship was incredible. You walk down the aisle, it was an aisle like this. Take the guys on this side of the drawing table, same thing over there, and you would cut overlays, what you have now on desktop. Had it all done by hand. Any separation with Ruby Lip or Amber Masks, and these guys were extraordinary craftsmen. They could do a separation you wouldn't even know it was one piece. It was amazing, but there was a lot of booze.